much of what we see today in talk around constitutional sheriffs and sheriff supremacy trace back to this white nationalist anti-Semitic group called the Posse Comitatus that was very active back in the 1970s and the 1980s. So the name actually is Latin for power of the county, and the posse really combined racism, anti-Semitism, and paramilitary training. Now, the posse thought that local community citizens weren't really supposed to be subject to state or federal authorities. And again, this idea that the county sheriff, being the highest legitimate law officer in the county, it was the sheriff's duty to protect local community members from what they viewed as these infringements by state and federal authorities on their constitutional rights. Now, the group, the posse, they swore to use force to oppose any of these perceived infringements on their constitutional rights, and that they would be there then to back up the sheriff to take on these outside entities that they believed had bad motives in coming and trying to take away their rights. So often with the posse in the 70s and 80s, what you'd see were focuses on income tax, guns, and property rights. So you'd have a tax protester who had not paid their income tax. When the IRS came to foreclose on property, the posse believed the sheriff was supposed to stop them. A local survivalist who had firearms and weapons that they weren't supposed to have. If the ATF tried to come in, the sheriff was supposed to stop them. If a rancher was grazing their cattle on Bureau of Land Management land, and they weren't supposed to be, and the BLM came in to seize the cattle, the sheriff was supposed to step in. So those were the types of examples that we generally saw back in the 70s and 80s, again, where the sheriff had all this authority, the sheriff had all this power, and then the posse as an organization was going to be there to back the sheriff up. So then we get through the 1980s and we get into the early 90s, and the militia movement that started to develop in the 90s basically picked up and dusted off a lot of the posse's ideas, including this idea of sheriff supremacy. And it really became a central piece of today's anti-government patriot movement. So for these patriots, they really believed that sheriffs would play a central role in helping communities fight off this invasion of shadowy one world government oppressors that always included our federal government. And these New World Order conspiracies, these one world government conspiracies were really, the base of a lot of their worldview and a lot of their ideology, and the sheriffs came to play this central role, that it was going to be up to them to, in many cases, kind of rally the troops, if you will, and lead communities in battling off these one world government forces. So this is where this idea of constitutional sheriffs and sheriff supremacy come from. But in order for these ideas to stick around since the 70s, there have to be these champions. There have to be these people in these organizations that are constantly pushing these ideas forward. And that is most definitely the case when it comes to sheriff supremacy.